Sometimes a man finds his purpose in the most unlikely places. Sometimes it takes a broken soul to heal another broken soul. When former Union scout Luke Marlowe arrives in Perdition Flats, he's given what the townspeople consider a death sentence, taming Hellspike, a black stallion so violent it's already killed one man and crippled 3 others. The locals expect to dig another grave by sunset. But Luke sees something different in the horse's wild eyes, something that reminds him of himself. As he slowly earns the stallion's trust, Luke discovers that Hellspike once belonged to a murdered rancher, and his death is connected to a deadly conspiracy that still haunts the town. The closer Luke gets to the truth, the more dangerous his world becomes. But what happens when the only witness to a murder is a horse that can't speak? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The dust of Perdition Flats settled into every crease of Luke Marlowe's weathered face as he guided his mare down the town's main street. The afternoon sun cast long shadows between the ramshackle buildings, and the air hung thick with the scent of cattle, sweat, and something else, fear. It was a smell he'd learned to recognize during his years as a Union scout, threading through Confederate camps where death waited behind every tree. Luke's fingers unconsciously touched the tarnished brass badge hidden beneath his vest, his old scout's insignia, the only thing he'd kept from those bloody years. Most men would have thrown it away, tried to forget. But Luke had learned that running from your past only gave it more power to catch up with you. The Silver Dollar Saloon squatted at the end of the street like a toad on a lily pad, its batwing doors swinging lazily in the evening breeze. Luke tied his mare to the hitching post and stepped inside, his boots announcing his arrival on the warped wooden floor. The conversations died like candles in a hurricane. "You Luke Marlowe?" The voice belonged to a thick-set man with a sheriff's star pinned crooked on his vest. His eyes were the color of muddy water, and they held the same warmth. "That be me," Luke replied, removing his hat. His dark hair was streaked with premature gray at the temples, testament to too many nights spent listening for enemy footsteps in the dark. "Name's Morrison, Sheriff Morrison." The man extended a hand that felt like tree bark. "Heard you might be interested in some work." Luke nodded, glancing around the saloon. A handful of cowboys nursed their whiskey at scattered tables, their eyes avoiding his gaze. Behind the bar, a woman with graying auburn hair polished glasses with mechanical precision. She had kind eyes, Luke noticed, but they carried the weight of someone who'd seen too much sorrow. "That's Martha," Morrison said, following his gaze. "Runs the place, makes the best coffee between here and Denver, if you can believe that." Martha looked up and offered a smile that seemed genuine. "Coffee's always fresh, mister, unlike some of the characters who drink it." A rumble of uncomfortable laughter rippled through the room, but it died quickly when the batwing doors swung open again. The man who entered commanded attention without saying a word. Tall and lean, with silver hair slicked back and a black coat that probably cost more than most men made in a year, he moved with the confidence of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Ezra Blackwood," Morrison muttered under his breath, "owns most of the cattle in 3 counties, and most of the men who work them." Blackwood's pale eyes found Luke immediately, sizing him up like a rancher evaluating livestock. "So you're the horsebreaker they sent for. I was expecting someone larger." "Size doesn't matter much when it comes to understanding horses, Mr. Blackwood." Luke's voice remained steady, but his hand instinctively shifted closer to his gun belt. Old habits. "Understanding?" Blackwood laughed, a sound like ice cracking. "Son, that animal out there isn't interested in understanding. Hellspike sent 3 good men to Doc Henley's surgery and put another in the ground. You sure you want to try your luck?" "I'm here to do a job," Luke said simply. "Your funeral." Blackwood turned to leave, then paused. "Literally, most likely. Hope you made your peace with whatever god you pray to." The saloon fell silent again after Blackwood left. Luke turned back to Morrison, who was wiping sweat from his forehead despite the evening chill. "Tell me about this horse," Luke said. Morrison glanced around nervously before leaning closer. "Hellspike belonged to Tom Whitmore. Good man, Tom. Ran a small spread about 5 miles north of town. Horse was gentle as a lamb, with him finest riding animal you ever saw. But after Tom died, something changed. Horse went wild, vicious, won't let anyone near him. How did Whitmore die?" "Robbery. At least, that's what we figure. Found him shot dead on the road back from town. Money was gone. Horse was standing guard over the body like a sentinel. We brought Hellspike back here, thinking maybe someone could calm him down. But he's been nothing but trouble since." Martha approached with a steaming mug of coffee, setting it down in front of Luke. "Tom was a good man," she said quietly. "Treated that horse like family. They understood each other in ways that went beyond words." Luke sipped the coffee. It was indeed excellent, and considered what he'd heard. In his experience, horses didn't just turn violent without reason. Something had broken this animal's trust, and broken trust was something Luke understood all too well. "Where is he now?" Luke asked. "Breaking pen behind Henderson's stable. Doc Henley's been treating him for rope burns and such. Previous attempts weren't exactly gentle." Morrison's expression darkened. "Snake Rawlings was the last one to try. Used spurs and whips and every cruel trick he could think of. Nearly got himself killed for the trouble. Snake works for Blackwood," Martha added, refilling Luke's cup. "Most of the rough men in town do." Luke finished his coffee and stood. "I'd like to see the horse." "It's nearly dark," Morrison warned. "Maybe wait until morning?" "Horses don't punch a time clock, Sheriff. Besides, sometimes the truth is easier to see in the shadows." The breaking pen sat behind Henderson's livery stable, surrounded by a crowd of onlookers, despite the late hour. News travelled fast in small towns, and the arrival of another would-be horsebreaker was apparently the evening's entertainment. Luke pushed through the crowd, ignoring the whispered predictions of his imminent demise. Hellspike stood in the center of the pen, and Luke's breath caught in his throat. The stallion was magnificent coal black, except for a white star on his forehead that caught the moonlight like a signal fire. But it was the horse's eyes that stopped Luke cold. They blazed with intelligence and fury, but beneath that, Luke saw something else. Fear. Raw. Desperate fear. The horse's neck and legs bore fresh rope burns, and older scars crisscrossed his hide like a roadmap of cruelty. Someone had tried to break this animal's spirit through pain, and the horse had chosen to fight back rather than surrender. "Beautiful, isn't he?" Doc Henley appeared at Luke's elbow. A small, neat man with spectacles and gentle hands, he looked more like a school teacher than a frontier doctor. "Shame what they've done to him. In my medical opinion, the horse isn't vicious. He's traumatized." Luke nodded, studying the stallion's posture. "He's protecting himself. Question is, from what? Or from whom?" Doc Henley said quietly. As if sensing Luke's scrutiny, Hellspike turned his head and locked eyes with the newcomer. For a moment, time seemed suspended. Luke felt a strange recognition pass between them. Two souls who had seen too much violence, endured too much pain, and learned to trust no one. "I'll start working with him tomorrow," Luke announced to no one in particular. A few men in the crowd chuckled, but most just shook their heads. They'd heard such confidence before, usually right before someone got trampled or kicked into next week. But as Luke walked back toward the silver dollar for a room and a hot meal, he found himself thinking about that look in Hellspike's eyes. It reminded him of the expression he'd seen in his own mirror for the past 5 years, the look of someone who'd lost everything that mattered and didn't know how to find his way back home. Maybe, Luke thought, two broken souls could help each other heal, or maybe they'd just destroy each other in the trying. Either way, he'd made his decision. Tomorrow, he'd begin the most important job of his life. Dawn broke over Perdition Flats with the subtlety of a gunshot, painting the eastern sky in shades of amber and rose. Luke had been awake for an hour, sitting on the edge of his bed in the room above the Silver Dollar, listening to the town wake up. Coffee brewing downstairs, the blacksmith's hammer already ringing against his anvil, the soft lowing of cattle in the distance, all the familiar sounds of frontier life that should have been comforting, but somehow felt weighted with unspoken tension. He dressed deliberately, checking his gear with the methodical precision that had kept him alive during the war. His Colt .45 sat snug in its holster, cleaned and loaded, but hopefully unnecessary. The real tools for today's work were simpler: a length of soft rope, some sugar cubes in his pocket, and most importantly, patience. The breaking pen was empty of spectators this early, which suited Luke just fine. Hellspike stood at the far end, head raised and nostrils flaring as Luke approached. Even from 20 feet away, the horse's tension was palpable, every muscle coiled like a spring ready to unleash violence. Luke climbed the fence slowly, announcing his presence without making any sudden movements. "Easy there, big fellow. Just came to talk." Hellspike's ears flattened against his skull, and he backed against the far fence, eyes never leaving Luke's face. Up close, the extent of the horse's injuries became clearer. The rope burns around his neck were deep and angry, still healing poorly. Dried blood crusted several wounds on his flanks, and his left rear leg favored itself, slightly evidence of a recent kick or fall. But it was what Luke saw next that made his blood turn cold. Fresh welts across the stallion's shoulders, made by something thin and sharp. Spurs, most likely, raked across tender flesh with deliberate cruelty. These weren't the marks of someone trying to break a horse. They were the marks of someone trying to break a spirit. "Jesus," Luke whispered, and Hellspike flinched at the sound. Luke spent the next hour simply sitting on the fence rail, making no move toward the horse, just being present. Occasionally, he'd speak in low, calm tones, not to the horse necessarily, but to the morning air, the way he used to talk to himself during long nights on scout patrol when the silence became too heavy to bear. "Had a horse like you once," he said eventually. "Mare named Duchess, smart as a whip and twice as stubborn. Took me 3 months to earn her trust, but once I did, she'd follow me through hell itself. Saved my life more times than I can count." Hellspike's ears twitched forward slightly, though his body remained rigid with suspicion. As the morning progressed, other townspeople began to drift by, some genuinely curious, others clearly hoping to witness another spectacular failure. Luke ignored them all, focused entirely on the horse. He'd learned long ago that healing took time, and time was something most people were unwilling to invest. Around noon, Martha appeared with a plate of food and a fresh cup of coffee. "Figured you might be hungry," she said, handing the meal through the fence rails. "Much obliged." Luke accepted the food gratefully. "Tell me about Thomas Whitmore. What kind of man was he?" Martha's expression softened. "The kind of man this territory needs more of. Fair, honest, never looked for trouble but wouldn't back down from it either. He'd been in Perdition Flats about 2 years, built up his ranch from nothing. That horse was his pride and joy. Any idea who might have wanted him dead?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a campfire. Martha glanced around nervously before leaning closer to the fence. "Tom was asking a lot of questions before he died. About land deeds, water rights, cattle that kept disappearing from small spreads. Made some folks uncomfortable. Folks like Ezra Blackwood?" "I didn't say that," Martha replied quickly, but her eyes confirmed what her words wouldn't. After she left, Luke returned his attention to Hellspike. The horse had moved closer during the conversation, drawn perhaps by the sound of voices or the scent of food. Luke broke off a piece of bread and tossed it gently toward the stallion. Hellspike shied away, but his eyes followed the bread's path to the ground. "Not hungry, or just don't trust where it came from?" Luke asked softly. The afternoon brought unwelcome visitors. Snake Rawlings swaggered into the area around the breaking pen, flanked by 2 other men cut from the same rough cloth. Snake was tall and wiry, with pale eyes and a thin moustache that made him look like a gambler down on his luck. The scar running from his left ear to the corner of his mouth suggested he'd found his share of trouble. "Well, well," Snake drawled, leaning against the fence. "Still in one piece, I see. Give it time." Luke remained seated on his rail, but his hand rested casually near his gun belt. "Something I can do for you boys?" "Just came to offer some friendly advice," Snake continued. "That horse killed a man, put 3 more in the hospital. Maybe it's time to accept that some things can't be fixed." "Maybe," Luke agreed, "but I've always been curious about lost causes." Snake's companions chuckled, but there was no humor in their leader's eyes. "Curiosity killed the cat, stranger. In these parts, it's killed a few men too. That a threat?" "Just an observation. This town's got its own way of doing things. Outsiders who don't understand that sometimes find themselves in unfortunate situations." Luke studied the 3 men carefully. They wore the look of hired guns, confident in their violence, comfortable with intimidation. The kind of men who solved problems with bullets and asked questions later. "I appreciate the concern," Luke said finally, "but I signed on to break this horse, and that's what I intend to do." Snake spat into the dust. "Your funeral." "Literally." After they left, Luke noticed that Hellspike had retreated to the far corner of the pen again, agitated by the presence of the 3 men. The horse's reaction was interesting, not just wariness, but active fear, as if he recognized them. The rest of the day passed quietly. Luke made no attempt to approach Hellspike directly, content to let the horse grow accustomed to his presence. As evening approached, Doc Henley stopped by to check on both man and beast. "How's he doing?" the doctor asked, nodding toward Hellspike. "Scared," Luke replied honestly. "Someone's been working him over pretty good. Those welts on his shoulders are fresh." Doc Henley's expression darkened. "Snake was bragging yesterday about teaching that devil some manners. Said he'd have the horse broken inside a week, one way or another. Looks like the horse had other ideas." "Indeed, Snake sporting some impressive bruises himself. Horse got him good with a rear kick before the other boys pulled him out of the pen." Luke nodded, filing away the information. As the doctor prepared to leave, Luke asked, "Doc, what really happened to Thomas Whitmore?" Henley paused, his medical bag halfway to his shoulder. "Officially, robbery. Shot twice in the chest on the road from town. Unofficially, Tom was carrying a lot of cash that night, proceeds from a cattle sale, but they left his horse, his saddle, even his gold pocket watch. What kind of robber takes the money but leaves everything else? The kind that wanted it to look like a robbery." "That's what I've been thinking, but thinking and proving are 2 different things." Doc Henley glanced around nervously. "Be careful, Luke. Tom was asking the wrong questions, and now he's dead. You start asking those same questions." The implication hung in the air like a storm cloud. After Doc Henley left, Luke remained at the pen as darkness settled over the town. Hellspike had moved closer again, near enough that Luke could hear his breathing, see the way moonlight reflected in his dark eyes. "You saw it, didn't you?" Luke said quietly. "You saw what happened to your master. That's why you won't let anyone near you. You know who the real enemy is." Hellspike took a step closer, ears forward, as if he understood every word. "Problem is, you can't tell anyone what you saw. Can't point fingers or give testimony. All you can do is fight back against anyone who reminds you of that night." The horse whickered softly, a sound that might have been agreement or might have been pain. In that moment, Luke made a decision that would change everything. He wasn't just here to break a horse anymore. He was here to solve a murder, expose the truth, and maybe find some justice for a good man who died asking the wrong questions to the wrong people. The only witness to Thomas Whitmore's murder stood 20 feet away, locked in a prison of trauma and fear. Luke's job was no longer about breaking Hellspike's spirit. It was about earning the trust of the only soul who knew what really happened that night on the road from Perdition Flats. The second day began before sunrise. Luke had learned during his scouting years that the hour before dawn often revealed truths that daylight kept hidden. He approached Hellspike's pen quietly, carrying a bucket of fresh water and a small portion of oats. The horse was awake, standing alert in the center of the enclosure, as if he'd been waiting. "Morning, partner," Luke said softly, setting the bucket and feed just inside the gate. "Thought you might be thirsty." Hellspike watched every movement with the intensity of a predator, but Luke noticed something different this morning. The horse's head was cocked slightly, as if he was listening not just to Luke's words, but to the tone beneath them. Luke settled onto his fence rail, perch, and pulled out a piece of jerky, chewing thoughtfully as he observed the stallion. After 20 minutes, Hellspike cautiously approached the water bucket, never taking his eyes off Luke, ready to bolt at the first sign of trouble. "That's it," Luke murmured. "Nobody's going to hurt you while I'm here." As the horse drank, Luke noticed something glinting in the corner of the pen, something that didn't belong with the straw and dust. He waited until Hellspike had moved away before climbing down to investigate. It was a feed box, old and weathered, tucked against the fence, where it was nearly invisible in the shadows. When Luke lifted the lid, he found it mostly empty except for some old grain and a few field mice that scurried away. But something about the box nagged at him. He ran his hands along the interior walls, feeling for anything unusual. His fingers found it a slight ridge where the wood didn't quite match, a false bottom, expertly crafted but detectable to someone who knew what to look for. Luke pried it open carefully and felt his breath catch. Inside lay a leather journal, wrapped in oilcloth to protect it from moisture. The cover was embossed with the initials T.W., Thomas Whitmore. Luke's hands trembled slightly as he opened it, knowing he was holding something that had likely cost a good man his life. The entries were written in a careful, educated hand. Most dealt with ranch business cattle counts, breeding records, expenses. But as Luke read deeper, darker themes emerged. Whitmore had been documenting strange occurrences around Perdition Flats with the methodical precision of a man building a case. April 15th. Johnson's north pasture fence cut again. Cattle driven off in the night. Sheriff claims rustlers, but no tracks leading away from the valley. Where did 200 head of beef just disappear to? April 20th. Widow Henderson says men came by offering to buy her land. When she refused, they suggested she might not be safe living alone so far from town. Same men Blackwood uses for his security. May 3rd. Found Charlie Robertson's prize bull shot dead in his south meadow. Charlie says it was probably wolves, but I've seen wolf kills. This was done with a rifle, close range. Someone wanted to send a message. Luke read entry after entry, watching as Whitmore documented a pattern of intimidation, theft, and violence, all designed to drive small ranchers off their land. The picture that emerged was of a systematic campaign, orchestrated by someone with resources and connections. The most disturbing entries came from late May. May 28th. Discovered why Blackwood wants Johnson's land so badly. Followed the creek upstream and found where it widens into a natural basin. Water rights here could control irrigation for half the territory. Johnson has no idea what he's sitting on. May 30th. Asked around about territorial land surveys. Official records show this area as mostly worthless scrub, but I've seen the soil quality, the water access. Someone's been filing false reports to keep land prices low. June 20th. Martha thinks I'm taking too many risks, and maybe she's right. But if I don't stand up to this, who will? These people came here to build something decent, something honest. They don't deserve to be driven out by lies and violence. The final entry was dated just 3 days before Whitmore's death. June 8th. I have enough evidence now. Survey maps, witness statements, records of cattle sales that don't match reported rustling losses. Tomorrow I ride to the territorial capital to file formal complaints. If something happens to me, I've hidden copies of everything. Hellspike knows the places. He's the smartest horse I've ever seen, and he's the only one I trust completely. Luke closed the journal, his mind racing. Whitmore hadn't just been a rancher, he'd been an investigator, methodically building a case against Blackwood and whatever larger conspiracy was behind the land grabbing. And somehow, Hellspike was key to finding the rest of the evidence. "You know, don't you?" Luke said, looking at the stallion who had watched his every movement while he read. "You know where he hid the other copies?" Hellspike's ears pricked forward, and he took a step closer. For just a moment, the fear in his eyes was replaced by something that looked almost like hope. The sound of approaching footsteps made Luke quickly rewrap the journal and slip it inside his vest. Sheriff Morrison appeared around the corner of the stable, looking haggard in the morning light. "You're up early," Morrison observed, though there was something in his tone that didn't match his casual words. "Old habit from the war," Luke replied easily. "Horse seems calmer in the morning." Morrison studied Hellspike, who had retreated to his usual position at the far end of the pen. "Any progress?" "Some. He let me get water and feed into the pen without trying to kick my head off. That's something." "I suppose." Morrison wiped sweat from his forehead despite the cool morning air. "Listen, Luke, maybe it's time to reconsider this whole arrangement. The town council's been talking, and some folks think it might be better to just put the horse down, end its suffering." Luke felt anger flare in his chest, but kept his voice level. "Horse doesn't look like he's suffering to me. Looks like he's fighting." "Fighting what?" "That's what I'm trying to figure out." Morrison's eyes narrowed slightly. "Be careful you don't go looking for mysteries that aren't there, Luke. Sometimes a dangerous horse is just a dangerous horse." After the sheriff left, Luke remained at the pen, thinking about what he'd read and what it meant. Whitmore had been building a case against powerful men who wouldn't hesitate to kill to protect their interests. The rancher's death hadn't been a random robbery, it had been an execution, pure and simple, and Hellspike had been there, had seen it all. Luke spent the rest of the morning working slowly with the horse, talking softly and moving with deliberate calm. By noon, he'd managed to reduce the distance between them to about 10 feet, close enough to see the intelligence burning in those dark eyes, close enough to recognize a kindred spirit. Both of them had witnessed violence. Both carried scars from betrayals of trust. Both had learned that survival sometimes meant becoming something harder and more dangerous than you'd ever wanted to be. "We're going to figure this out together," Luke promised as he prepared to leave for lunch. "Your master deserves justice, and you deserve peace. I aim to see that you both get what you're owed." Hellspike whickered softly, the first sound he'd made that wasn't born of fear or anger. It wasn't much, but it was a beginning. And in Luke's experience, beginnings were often the hardest part. The third day brought unexpected visitors. Luke was sitting on his usual perch, watching Hellspike carefully investigate the morning's offering of oats, when he noticed the stallion's sudden change in posture. The horse's head snapped up, ears swiveled toward the street, and his entire body went rigid with alert tension. 3 men approached the pen, not Snake Rawlings this time, but cut from similar cloth. They moved with the swagger of men accustomed to getting their way through intimidation. Luke recognized the type from his war days, bullies who were brave in groups but cowards when facing a fair fight. The leader wore a distinctive silver concho belt buckle that caught the morning sun. It was crafted in an elaborate Spanish style, probably worth more than most men made in a month. When he reached the fence, he spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust and grinned at Luke with teeth stained brown. "You the horsebreaker?" he asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "I'm working with the horse, yes." "Name's Pete Gunner. These are my associates, Mills and Crawford. We work for Mr. Blackwood." He gestured carelessly toward his companions. "Mr. Blackwood's getting impatient. Says maybe it's time to try a more direct approach with this animal." Luke glanced at Hellspike, who had retreated to the far corner of the pen, but kept his eyes fixed on the 3 men. The horse's behavior was telling not just general wariness, but specific recognition and fear. "Horse is making progress," Luke said calmly. "These things take time." "Time's something Mr. Blackwood's running short on," Mills interjected. He was a thick-shouldered man with scarred knuckles and the flat eyes of a born killer. "Got buyers coming next week who want to see that horse performing like he's supposed to." "Performing?" "Racing, mostly. Gunner explained. Hellspike's got bloodlines worth more than this whole damn town. Before he went crazy, he was the fastest horse anyone had ever seen. Mr. Blackwood's got gentlemen coming from as far as San Francisco to see him run. Luke absorbed this information, filing it away with everything else he'd learned. Horse won't run for anyone while he's carrying all that fear and pain. Crawford laughed harshly. Fear and pain? Hell, that's what makes a horse run fast, knowing there's consequences for being slow. Not this horse. Gunner's expression hardened. Maybe you don't understand the situation here, friend. Mr. Blackwood's been patient, but that patience has limits. You got 3 more days to have that horse ready to ride. After that, we try things our way. And what way is that? The permanent way, Mills said with a cold smile. After they left, Luke climbed down into the pen for the first time. Hellspike tensed, but didn't immediately bolt to the far corner progress of a sort. Luke approached slowly, hands visible and empty, moving with the careful precision he'd used when stalking Confederate sentries in the dark. Easy, boy. I saw how you reacted to those men. You know them, don't you? Hellspike's nostrils flared, and he took a half-step forward. Luke continued moving slowly until he was close enough to see the details of the horse's scars, close enough to understand the full extent of the abuse he'd endured. That's when he saw it embedded in the dirt near where Hellspike had been standing was that distinctive silver concho. It was tarnished and dented, as if it had been trampled repeatedly by iron-shod hooves. Luke picked up the ornament, brushing off the dirt, and held it where Hellspike could see it. The horse's reaction was immediate and violent. He reared up on his hind legs, striking at the air with his front hooves, eyes rolling white with terror and rage. Easy! Luke dropped the concho and backed away quickly. Easy, boy. It's gone. But Hellspike continued his display of fury, snorting and pawing the ground where the silver piece had fallen. Luke watched with growing understanding. This wasn't random violence, this was targeted hatred. The horse recognized that concho, connected it with pain and fear and loss. It took nearly an hour for Hellspike to calm down, and even then he kept glancing at the spot where the concho lay half buried in the churned earth. Luke left it there, knowing now that it was evidence of a crime, proof that Pete Gunner, or someone wearing his belt, had been in this pen before, had been part of whatever had broken this magnificent animal's spirit. That afternoon, Luke sought out Doc Henley at his office above the barber shop. The doctor was cleaning instruments with the methodical care of a man who understood that cleanliness could mean the difference between life and death. Doc, I need to ask you about the men who tried to break Hellspike before me. Henley paused in his work, glancing toward the window that overlooked the main street. What about them? I need names, and I need to know exactly what injuries they sustained. That's patient confidentiality, Luke. I can't just... Doc. Luke's voice carried the quiet authority he'd learned, commanding men in life-or-death situations. That horse has been tortured. Systematically, whoever did it is still walking around free, and they're planning to finish the job in 3 days. Henley set down his instruments and studied Luke's face. Whatever he saw there seemed to convince him. The first man was Johnny Morse. Dislocated shoulder, broken ribs, concussion. Said the horse went crazy for no reason, but... He paused. But what? Johnny was drunk when he came in. Kept talking about how they should have just shot the horse when they had the chance, saved everyone the trouble. When I asked him what he meant, he clammed up real quick. What about the others? Snake rollings you know about. Broken wrist, deep lacerations on his arms and back. Third man was Pete Gunner. Gunner was hurt by the horse? Stepped on his foot, broke 2 toes. But that's not the interesting part. Henley moved to his desk and pulled out a ledger. All 3 men came in wearing the same cologne. Expensive stuff, not what you'd expect from cowboys. And all 3 had fresh scratches on their hands and arms, the kind you get from handling barbed wire. And Luke felt pieces clicking into place. They were setting traps, using wire to try to snare him. That's what I figured. Hellspike's too smart to be caught easily, but if you could tangle his legs in wire... Henley shuddered. cruel way to break a horse. Cruel way to break anything. Luke left the doctor's office with his mind churning. The pattern was becoming clearer. Blackwood's men weren't just trying to break Hellspike for riding. They were trying to break him completely, to destroy any possibility that the horse might lead someone to whatever evidence Thomas Whitmore had hidden. That evening, Luke returned to the pen with a new understanding of what he was dealing with. Hellspike had been tortured not just for sport, but as part of a larger cover-up. The horse was a living witness to murder, and there were powerful men who would do anything to silence that witness permanently. "We're running out of time, partner," Luke said softly as he settled onto his fence rail. "They're planning something, and I don't think either of us is going to like it." Hellspike approached closer than he ever had before, stopping just 8 feet away. In the fading light, Luke could see the intelligence burning in those dark eyes, and something else. Recognition, trust, perhaps, or at least the beginning of it. "Your master was a good man, wasn't he? Trying to do the right thing in a place where right and wrong get twisted up with money and power." The horse whickered softly, a sound that carried both grief and agreement. "I'm going to find out who killed him," Luke promised, "and I'm going to make sure they pay for what they did to both of you." As if understanding every word, Hellspike took another step forward, close enough now that Luke could have reached out and touched his muzzle. Instead, Luke remained perfectly still, letting the horse make the choice. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other, two survivors, recognizing the scars they shared. Then, Hellspike stepped back, but not in fear this time, in preparation. Luke had the strangest feeling that the horse was getting ready for something, that whatever came next, Hellspike intended to be part of it. The war for Thomas Whitmore's justice was about to begin, and Luke had just gained the most important ally he could have asked for, the only witness who knew the whole truth. The fourth morning brought an unexpected discovery. Luke arrived at the pen to find Hellspike standing near the gate, alert but not aggressive. More importantly, he was standing next to a saddle, not just any saddle, but a beautiful piece of craftsmanship with silver conchos and hand-tooled leather that had been hidden beneath a tarp in the corner of the pen. "Well, I'll be damned," Luke murmured, climbing over the fence. "That's got to be Whitmore's saddle." Hellspike watched as Luke approached the saddle, but for the first time, there was no fear in his posture. If anything, the horse seemed to be presenting it, as if he'd been waiting for someone he trusted enough to show this hidden treasure. Luke examined the saddle carefully. It was a work of art, the kind that cost more than most men made in a year. But it was what he found tucked into a hidden compartment behind the cantle that made his breath catch. Another piece of oilcloth, this one wrapped around a surveyor's map, marked with Whitmore's careful annotations. The map showed the entire Perdition Flats area, but not as Luke had seen it described in any official documents. According to Whitmore's notations, the land around Johnson's ranch sat directly over what appeared to be a significant silver vein. More importantly, the creek that ran through the area could be diverted to create a substantial water source enough to irrigate thousands of acres that were currently considered worthless desert. Red X marks indicated the locations of other small ranches, each with notes about water rights, mineral surveys, and land claims. A pattern emerged as Luke studied the map. Someone with inside knowledge of the territorial surveys was systematically acquiring land that appeared worthless, but was actually sitting on significant resources. At the bottom of the map, in Whitmore's careful handwriting, was a note that made Luke's blood run cold. Federal land grants based on falsified surveys, water rights illegally transferred, mineral claims filed under false names, estimated value $2 million plus, evidence buried at Widow's Peak, Devil's Canyon, and Broken Creek. H knows the way. H had to be Hellspike. Whitmore had trained his horse to navigate to the hiding places where he'd stashed copies of his evidence. The Stallion wasn't just a witness to murder, he was a living map to the proof that could bring down the entire conspiracy. Luke looked up from the map to find Hellspike watching him intently. "You understand, don't you? You know what this means." The horse stepped closer, close enough that Luke could feel his warm breath. For the first time since arriving in Perdition Flats, Luke reached out slowly and let his fingers brush against Hellspike's muzzle. The horse didn't pull away. "We're going to finish what your master started," Luke said quietly. "But first, we need to get you ready to travel. And we need to do it without anyone knowing what we're planning." The rest of the morning was spent in careful preparation. Luke began working with Hellspike more directly, using the gentling techniques he'd learned from an old Apache scout during his army days. The horse responded better than Luke had dared hope, as if Whitmore's training had never really been broken, just buried under layers of trauma and fear. By noon, Luke could lead Hellspike around the pen with a simple rope halter. The horse still carried his scars, still flinched at sudden movements, but the wild fury that had characterized his behavior was being replaced by something more focused purpose. Their work was interrupted by the arrival of Sheriff Morrison and two men Luke didn't recognize. Both newcomers wore the dusty clothes of travelers, but their boots were expensive and their guns well-maintained. One was tall and lean with a carefully groomed mustache. The other shorter and broader, with the thick hands of a man who'd done hard work, but somehow managed to avoid the calluses. "Luke," Morrison called out, "like you to meet some folks. This here's Mr. Benjamin Carter from the Territorial Land Office and Mr. James Walsh from the Cattle Association." Carter stepped forward with the confident manner of a bureaucrat accustomed to being important. "Mr. Marlowe, we've heard about your work with this animal. Impressive progress, from what the sheriff tells us." "Still early days," Luke replied carefully, studying both men. Something about their presence felt wrong, too convenient, too well-timed. "Nevertheless," Walsh interjected, "we're here on official business. The territorial government has decided that this horse represents a potential danger to public safety. We're here to evaluate whether he should be permanently retired." Luke felt Hellspike tense beside him, as if the horse understood the euphemism. "Horse isn't dangerous, he's traumatized. There's a difference." "Is there?" Carter pulled out a leather portfolio and consulted some papers. "According to our records, this animal has attacked 4 men, killing 1. That seems like a clear case of a dangerous animal that needs to be put down. Your records are incomplete." "Are they?" Walsh smiled coldly. "Perhaps you'd like to enlighten us about what we're missing." Luke realized he was walking into a trap. These men weren't here for any official evaluation. They were here to eliminate the last witness to Thomas Whitmore's murder. And they were using the authority of the territorial government to do it legally. "Horse just needs time and proper handling," Luke said evenly. "I've seen worse cases recover completely." "Time is something we don't have," Carter replied. "Mr. Blackwood has filed a formal complaint with the territorial authority, claiming this animal represents an ongoing threat to his business interests. He's requesting immediate action." "What kind of action?" Walsh drew his sidearm with practiced ease. "The permanent kind." Hellspike reared at the sight of the gun, striking out with his front hooves. Luke grabbed the lead rope and spoke sharply. "Easy! Easy, boy!" "You see?" Carter gestured at the horse's reaction. "Clearly unstable. Dangerous. Sheriff Morrison, please step back while Mr. Walsh handles this situation." But Morrison wasn't moving. In fact, Luke noticed the sheriff's hand was resting on his own gun butt, and his expression had gone carefully neutral. "Now hold on just a minute," Morrison said slowly. "This horse is town property until the breaking contract is completed. You boys don't have jurisdiction here." "We have territorial authority," Carter snapped. "Show me the paperwork." For the first time, Carter looked uncertain. "The paperwork is being processed." "Then you got no authority at all," Morrison concluded. "Luke's got 3 more days on his contract. Until then, that horse stays alive." Walsh's gun remained drawn, but he seemed unsure how to proceed. The confrontation hung in the air like smoke from a grass fire, dangerous and unpredictable. Luke used the moment of confusion to position himself between the gunman and Hellspike. "Gentlemen, why don't we all take a step back and discuss this reasonably?" "Nothing to discuss," Walsh growled. "Horse is dangerous, and dangerous animals get put down." "Not today they don't," Morrison said firmly. The standoff lasted another tense minute before Carter apparently decided retreat was the better part of valor. "Very well, Sheriff, but we'll be back with proper authorization. And when we return, this matter will be resolved permanently." After they left, Morrison holstered his gun and turned to Luke. "You got any idea what that was really about?" Luke looked at Hellspike, who had calmed down but remained alert and ready for trouble. "I'm starting to get a pretty clear picture, Sheriff. Question is, whose side are you really on?" Morrison met his gaze steadily. "I'm on the side of justice, Luke. Always have been. Problem is, sometimes justice and the law don't quite line up the way they should." It was the most honest thing anyone in Perdition Flats had said to Luke since his arrival, and it suggested that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't as alone in this fight as he'd thought. That evening, Luke made a decision that would change everything. Hidden in his room, above the silver dollar, he carefully cleaned and oiled a pair of spurs he'd found wrapped in Whitmore's saddle, distinctive Mexican rowels with intricate silver inlay work that had probably been crafted by a master artisan south of the border. The spurs were beautiful, but more importantly, they carried the scent and memory of Hellspike's murdered master. Luke had seen enough broken soldiers during the war to understand how powerful familiar objects could be in reaching through trauma to the person, or in this case, the horse trapped inside. When he approached the pen the next morning carrying the spurs, Hellspike's reaction was immediate and profound. The stallion's head came up sharply, nostrils flaring as he caught the familiar scent. But instead of the fear and rage Luke had expected, something else flickered in those dark eyes: recognition, memory, and beneath it all, a grief so deep it seemed to echo in the morning air. "You remember him, don't you?" Luke said softly, holding the spurs where Hellspike could see them. "These were his. He wore them when he rode you." Hellspike approached slowly, each step deliberate and careful. When he reached Luke, he lowered his great head and gently nuzzled the spurs, breathing in the scent of the man who had loved him. The sound he made was unlike anything Luke had heard from him before, a low, mournful whicker that spoke of loss and longing. "I know, boy. I know you miss him." For the next hour, Luke worked with Hellspike while wearing the spurs, not using them to direct the horse, but simply letting their presence rebuild the connection between past and present. The stallion's entire demeanor changed. The constant tension that had defined his posture melted away, replaced by something that looked almost like peace. It was during this session that Luke first noticed Hellspike responding to commands in Spanish, not just simple directions, but complex instructions that suggested sophisticated training. When Luke said "Busca el sendero," find the trail, the horse's ears pricked forward, and he moved toward the eastern edge of the pen. When he said "Lugar secreto," secret place, Hellspike actually pawed the ground and looked toward the mountains. "Whitmore trained you to navigate to specific locations, didn't he? Places where he hid his evidence." The horse bobbed his head as if in agreement, and Luke felt a chill run down his spine. He was dealing with an animal that had been trained not just for riding, but for intelligence work, carrying messages, finding hidden locations, remembering complex routes through difficult terrain. Their work was interrupted by Martha's arrival with lunch and troubling news. "Luke, you need to know Snake Rawlings was asking questions about you last night. Wanted to know where you came from, what your business was before you got here. What did you tell him?" "Nothing, because I don't know anything. But he was also asking about Tom Whitmore's saddle. Seems to think it should have been sold off with the rest of Tom's property." Luke glanced at the saddle, now prominently displayed on the fence rail where anyone could see it. "What happened to the rest of Whitmore's belongings?" "Auctioned off to pay his debts, supposedly. Though folks noticed that Blackwood bought most everything, usually for less than it was worth." Martha's expression darkened. including Tom's land, which went for back taxes a week after he died. Convenient timing. Very convenient. Too convenient, if you ask me. After Martha left, Luke spent the afternoon working more intensively with Hellspike, using the horse's responses to Spanish commands to map out what appeared to be a complex navigation system. Whitmore had essentially turned his horse into a living compass, capable of finding hidden locations across the territory, even in darkness or bad weather. By evening, Luke felt confident enough to attempt something that would have been suicide just days earlier, saddling Hellspike. He moved slowly, talking constantly in the gentle tones the horse had come to trust, using Whitmore's own tack to bridge the gap between past and present. Hellspike trembled as the saddle settled onto his back, but he didn't explode into violence. Instead, he stood perfectly still, as if remembering what it felt like to carry a rider he trusted. "Easy, boy. We're going to take this slow." Luke had just finished tightening the cinch when he heard voices approaching from the street. He recognized Snake Rawlings's distinctive drawl, but there were others with him more than before. Luke quickly loosened the cinch and pulled the saddle off, not wanting to reveal how much progress he'd actually made. 6 men approached the pen this time, all armed and moving with the purposeful coordination of a military unit. Snake led them, flanked by Pete Gunner and 4 others Luke didn't recognize. These weren't local cowboys or drifters. They moved like professional killers, men who'd done this kind of work before. "Evening, horsebreaker," Snake called out with false cheer. "Thought we'd stop by and see how our friend Hellspike is doing." "Horse is fine, getting better every day." "Is he now?" Snake's pale eyes studied both Luke and the Stallion with obvious suspicion. "Funny thing, though, some of the boys have been watching, and they swear they saw you saddling him earlier." "You calling me a liar?" "I'm saying maybe you're making more progress than you're letting on. Maybe it's time for a little demonstration." Gunner stepped forward, his hand resting on his gun butt. "Mr. Blackwood wants to see this horse ridden. Tonight." Luke felt the trap closing around him. If he refused, they'd know he was stalling. If he agreed and failed, they'd have an excuse to kill Hellspike for being too dangerous. If he succeeded, they'd know the horse was ready for whatever they really had planned. "Horse isn't ready for riding yet," Luke said evenly. "Still too skittish, too unpredictable. Let us be the judge of that," Snake replied. "Boys, why don't you help Mr. Marlowe demonstrate his progress?" The 6 men spread out around the pen, effectively surrounding Luke and Hellspike. The Stallion sensed the threat immediately, moving to position himself between Luke and the armed men. His protective instinct was so strong and immediate that even Snake seemed surprised. "Well, I'll be damned," Snake murmured. "Horse has taken a shine to you, hasn't he? That's going to make what comes next even more interesting." Luke's hand moved instinctively toward his gun, but 6 against 1 were impossible odds. His only advantage was that they apparently wanted Hellspike alive, at least for now. "What exactly comes next?" Luke asked. Snake smiled, showing those tobacco-stained teeth. "Why, Mr. Blackwood wants to have a little talk with you. About horses and dead ranchers and folks who ask too many questions about things that ain't their business. And if I refuse, then your horse-breaking career comes to a real sudden end." Luke looked at Hellspike, who was watching the exchange with obvious intelligence. The horse understood they were in danger. His entire body was coiled and ready for fight or flight. "Guess I don't have much choice," Luke said finally. "Now you're being smart," Snake replied. "Gunner, you and Mills stay here and keep an eye on our 4-legged friend. Rest of you, let's take Mr. Marlowe to see the boss." As they prepared to leave, Luke caught Hellspike's eye and said quietly in Spanish, "Espera, volveré." "Wait, I'll be back." The horse's ears flicked forward, acknowledging the command. Luke only hoped he'd live long enough to keep that promise. The ride to Blackwood's ranch took place in tense silence, with Luke surrounded by armed men who made no attempt to hide their intentions. But as they approached the imposing 2-story house that dominated the valley like a feudal castle, Luke noticed something that made his blood run cold. Federal horses tied to the hitching post, their distinctive military tack, marking them as government mounts. "Looks like you got company," Luke observed. "Mr. Blackwood keeps important friends," Snake replied with obvious satisfaction. "Territorial officials, federal marshals, even some folks from Washington. Man's got connections you wouldn't believe." Luke was escorted into Blackwood's study, a room that spoke of wealth and power accumulated through means both legal and otherwise. The walls were lined with books that looked more decorative than functional, and a massive elk head mounted above the fireplace seemed to watch everything with glassy, judgmental eyes. Blackwood sat behind an ornate desk, but he wasn't alone. Sheriff Morrison stood near the window, his expression unreadable, while two other men occupied leather chairs near the fireplace. Luke recognized one of them, Benjamin Carter, from the Territorial Land Office. The other was a stranger, but his bearing and expensive clothes marked him as someone of importance. "Mr. Marlowe," Blackwood said without preamble, "I believe you've met Mr. Carter. Allow me to introduce Federal Marshal William Hayes." Hayes rose and extended his hand, studying Luke with sharp grey eyes. "Mr. Marlowe, I understand you've been having some success with that troublesome horse." Luke shook the offered hand, his mind racing. A federal marshal's presence changed everything. Either the conspiracy went higher than he'd imagined, or help had finally arrived. "Horse is coming along," Luke replied cautiously. "Indeed. In fact, Sheriff Morrison here has been telling us some very interesting things about your methods, haven't you, Sheriff?" Morrison stepped forward, and Luke tensed, expecting betrayal. Instead, the sheriff pulled something from his vest pocket, a brass badge, but not a local sheriff's star. This one bore the distinctive eagle and shield of a federal marshal. "My name is actually Deputy Marshal Morrison," the sheriff said quietly. "I've been working undercover in Perdition Flats for the past 8 months, investigating reports of systematic land fraud and murder." Luke felt the world shift beneath his feet. "You're federal law?" "We both are," Morrison continued. "Marshal Hayes here is my supervisor. We've been building a case against the Territorial Land Office conspiracy, but we needed someone to help us break the final piece of evidence, the testimony locked inside that horse's behavior." Luke looked around the room, trying to process this revelation. "Then why did I bring you here at gunpoint?" Snake Rawlings stepped out from behind a bookshelf, his gun drawn but not pointed at Luke. "Because there are still people in this town who think I work for Blackwood, people who needed to see you being taken prisoner. You're federal too?" "Texas Ranger, actually, on loan to the Marshal Service. Been working this case for over a year." Luke's head was spinning. "How many of you are there?" Marshal Hayes smiled grimly. "Enough. The conspiracy you've stumbled into involves forged federal land surveys, murdered territorial inspectors, and illegal mineral claims worth millions of dollars. It goes all the way to Washington, involving territorial politicians, federal land office officials, and several major cattle barons. But not Blackwood? Oh, Blackwood's guilty as sin," Morrison said. "But he's small fish. The real target is the network of corrupt officials who've been enabling men like him to steal land and murder anyone who gets in their way." Luke absorbed this information, feeling pieces click into place. Thomas Whitmore wasn't just investigating local land fraud, he was documenting part of a territorial-wide conspiracy. "Exactly, and he was working with us." Hayes pulled out a leather portfolio. "Tom was our primary undercover operative in this area. The evidence he gathered before his death is crucial to bringing down the entire network. Evidence that's hidden in locations only Hellspike can find. Which is why that horse has become so important to everyone involved, and why there have been several attempts to either control him or eliminate him." Luke thought about the supposed territorial officials who'd tried to have Hellspike killed. The men who came with Carter yesterday, they weren't really government agents, were they? "Carter is legitimate, but he's been turned. The man with him was one of Blackwood's hired killers, using forged federal credentials." Morrison's expression darkened. We've been tracking their movements for weeks, waiting for them to make their move. So everything I've been told about this situation has been a carefully constructed lie," Hayes finished. "Whitmore's murder, the supposed robbery, even the story about Hellspike turning vicious, all designed to cover up the fact that the horse witnessed a federal agent's assassination and might be able to lead investigators to evidence that could topple a conspiracy worth millions." Luke felt anger building in his chest. "And you let me walk into this blind? Let me believe I was just breaking a traumatized horse?" "We needed your reaction to be genuine," Snake, or whoever he really was, explained. "If you'd known the truth from the beginning, you might have acted differently. The people we're after are smart and well-connected. They can spot a setup from miles away. Plus," Morrison added, "we weren't entirely sure we could trust you. For all we knew, you could have been part of the conspiracy yourself." "What changed your mind?" Hayes pulled out a familiar-looking journal, Thomas Whitmore's hidden evidence. "When you found Tom's journal and didn't immediately turn it over to Blackwood or destroy it, we knew you were either innocent or the best actor we'd ever encountered. You've been watching me the whole time, every minute, and we've been impressed. The progress you've made with Hellspike in just a few days is remarkable. Tom spent months training that horse, and the trauma of witnessing his murder nearly undid all of it." Luke looked around the room at the faces of men he'd thought were enemies, or at best, unreliable allies. "So what happens now?" "Now," Marshal Hayes said, standing and moving to a map on Blackwood's wall, "you help us recover the evidence Tom hid. According to his journal, there are 3 cache sites that Hellspike knows how to find. One contains original survey documents proving the Federal Land Office has been filing false reports. Another has witness statements from other murdered agents. The third has financial records showing money trails that lead directly to Washington. And once we have that evidence, we spring the trap, arrest everyone involved, from Blackwood and his hired killers, all the way up to the territorial officials who've been enabling this whole operation." Morrison stepped forward. "But there's one problem. The real Blackwood, the man whose identity I've been assuming, is due back tomorrow. When he arrives and finds federal agents in his house, the whole operation goes public. We need to recover that evidence tonight." Luke thought about Hellspike, probably still surrounded by armed men at the breaking pen. "What about the horse?" "That's where you come in," Hayes replied. "We need you to get Hellspike out of town and guide him to those cache sites. Can you do it?" Luke considered the question. A few days ago, Hellspike would have killed him for getting too close. Now, the horse trusted him enough to wear a saddle. It would have to be enough. "Yeah," he said finally. "I can do it, but I'm going to need that horse to trust me completely, and I'm going to need to know everyone who's really on our side." "Everyone in this room," Hayes confirmed, "plus Doc Henley, Martha at the Silver Dollar, and about a dozen federal agents positioned around the territory." "Martha's federal too?" "Retired Pinkerton detective," Morrison said with a slight smile. "Tom's handler and our communications center." Luke shook his head in amazement. "Is anyone in this town actually who they pretend to be?" "You are," Snake said seriously, "and that might be exactly what we need to pull this off." The plan they devised was audacious in its simplicity and terrifying in its risks. Luke would return to the breaking pen as if nothing had happened, then wait until the early morning hours to execute what would appear to be a desperate escape attempt with Hellspike. Meanwhile, the federal agents would position themselves along the routes to Whitmore's cache sites, ready to provide backup if things went wrong. "The first location is Widow's Peak," Marshal Hayes explained, pointing to a spot on the map that looked impossibly remote. According to Tom's notes, he buried a lockbox containing original survey documents about a mile east of the summit. Hellspike should know the exact location. "Second site is Devil's Canyon," Morrison added. "Witness statements and correspondence with other federal agents. Tom was coordinating with investigators across 3 territories before he was killed." "Third site is the most important," Snake continued. "Broken Creek. Financial records showing money transfers from Washington to territorial officials, plus a list of other agents who've been murdered or have disappeared. That evidence alone could bring down half the territorial government. Luke studied the map, memorizing distances and landmarks. "How long do I have?" "Real Blackwood is expected tomorrow evening," Hayes replied. "That gives us roughly 18 hours to recover the evidence, verify its authenticity, and coordinate arrests across multiple territories. If we don't have everything in place by then, people are going to start disappearing, and evidence is going to start getting destroyed." "What about the men guarding Hellspike?" "Gunner and Mills are both legitimate Blackwood employees," Morrison said. "They don't know about the federal investigation, so they're still following Blackwood's original orders. Keep the horse alive, but don't let anyone get too close to him." "And Snake?" The Texas Ranger grinned. "I'll be returning to my usual charming self, complaining about guard duty and looking for excuses to leave those two alone with their prisoner. Shouldn't be too hard to create a distraction when you need it." Luke felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. Everything depended on his ability to communicate with a traumatized horse and navigate to locations he'd never seen, based on directions from a dead man. "There's something else you need to know," Hayes said quietly. "Tom's journal mentions that Hellspike was trained to respond to specific coded messages, phrases that would tell him when to lead someone to the cache sites versus when to lead them away from danger. You know these codes? Some of them. Buscar la verdad means find the truth, that should trigger his navigation training for the cache sites. Peligro cerca means danger close. He's trained to find escape routes when he hears that." Morrison pulled out a worn piece of paper. "Tom also trained him to respond to written commands. If something happens to you, if you can't speak the codes, you can write them down and show them to the horse. He can apparently read basic Spanish." Luke stared at the paper, amazed again at the depth of training Whitmore had given his horse. "How long did it take to teach him all this?" "According to Martha, Tom spent every free moment with that horse for 2 years, taught him like you'd teach a partner, not just an animal." As they prepared to leave Blackwood's house, Hayes pulled Luke aside for a final private conversation. "Luke, I need you to understand something. The men we're after have killed federal agents, territorial officials, and civilians without hesitation. If they realize what we're doing, they'll come after you with everything they have." "I understand." "Do you? Because once you ride out of town with that horse, you're going to be completely on your own until you reach the cache sites. We can't provide backup without blowing our cover." Luke thought about Hellspike, about the intelligence he'd seen in those dark eyes, about the trust that had slowly developed between them. "I won't be alone. I'll have a partner who knows this country better than anyone. A horse who's been traumatized by witnessing murder and torture. A horse who wants justice for his master as much as we do." Hayes studied Luke's face for a long moment. Tom said something similar about Hellspike, that he was more than just an animal, that he understood concepts like loyalty and justice in ways that most humans never do. Tom was right. I hope so. Because if this goes wrong, if you can't reach those cache sites, or if the evidence isn't there, a lot of very bad people are going to walk away free, and they'll make sure that no one ever tries to stop them again. The return journey to town was conducted in the same theatrical manner as the trip out, with Luke apparently under guard and heading for an uncertain fate. But now he understood the performance, knew that the grim faces around him concealed allies rather than enemies. When they reached the breaking pen, Luke was relieved to see that Hellspike appeared unharmed. The horse had been pacing the enclosure, clearly agitated by his absence, but he calmed immediately when Luke came into view. "Horse missed you," Gunner observed with surprise. "Been restless as a caged cat since you left." "Animals know when their routine gets disrupted," Luke replied, climbing into the pen. Hellspike approached immediately, nuzzling Luke's shoulder as if to confirm he was really back and unharmed. "Mr. Blackwood wants to see some real progress tomorrow," Mills announced. "Says if you can't get that horse under saddle and riding by noon, he's going to try a different approach." "Different how?" Mills smiled coldly. Let's just say it involves a lot less patience and a lot more persuasion. After the guards settled in for their watch, Luke spent the evening working with Hellspike, ostensibly continuing his training but actually preparing for their midnight escape. He saddled and unsaddled the horse several times, letting him grow comfortable with the process. More importantly, he tested the Spanish commands Hayes had taught him. When he quietly said "Busca la verdad," Hellspike's entire demeanor changed. His head came up alertly, and he moved to face the eastern mountains, where the cache sites waited. The horse remembered his training, remembered his mission. "Peligro cerca," Luke whispered, and Hellspike immediately shifted to face the western trail that led away from town. The escape route. As midnight approached, Luke made his final preparations. He'd hidden Whitmore's spurs in his saddlebags, along with extra ammunition and the few supplies he could carry without attracting attention. The coded phrases were written on a piece of paper tucked inside his shirt, insurance against injury or circumstances that might prevent him from speaking. Most importantly, he'd found something else in Whitmore's saddlebags, a letter wrapped in oilcloth and marked with instructions that made Luke's chest tight with emotion. "For whoever earns Hellspike's trust, if something happens to me, this horse is the key to everything. He knows where the truth is buried, and he'll lead you there if you treat him with the respect and kindness he deserves. He's not just an animal, he's my partner, my friend, and the only witness to crimes that must not go unpunished. Trust him as I have trusted him, and he will help you finish what we started. Thomas Whitmore." Luke carefully folded the letter and tucked it away, feeling the weight of a dead man's trust settling on his shoulders. Whitmore had prepared for his own death, had known the risks he was taking, and had counted on someone like Luke to continue his work. At midnight, Snake created the distraction they needed. A commotion near the Silver Dollar, apparently a fight between two drunk cowboys, drew both Gunner and Mills away from their guard posts. They left reluctantly, but the sound of breaking glass and shouting convinced them that their presence was needed to maintain order. Luke had perhaps 10 minutes before they returned. He worked quickly, saddling Hellspike with practiced efficiency. The horse stood perfectly still, as if he understood the gravity of what they were about to attempt. "This is it, partner," Luke whispered as he led Hellspike to the gate. "Time to finish what your master started." The escape itself was almost anticlimactic. Luke had scouted the route earlier, identifying the path that would take them out of town with the least chance of being seen. Hellspike moved like a ghost, his hooves making barely a whisper on the soft earth as they navigated between buildings and around sleeping camps. Once they reached the edge of town, Luke mounted and felt the powerful horse gather himself beneath the saddle. For a moment, he remembered Hellspike's reputation for violence, wondered if the horse would accept a rider or explode into the fury that had hospitalized 3 men and killed another. Instead, Hellspike stood perfectly still, waiting for direction. When Luke touched his heels gently to the horse's sides, the stallion moved forward with the smooth gait of a well-trained mount. The trust between them was complete. They rode east toward the mountains, guided by moonlight and the horse's infallible memory of routes he'd traveled with his murdered master. Luke felt a strange sense of peace despite the danger they faced. For the first time since the war ended, he was doing something that mattered, something that could bring justice to people who deserved it, and punishment to those who had earned it. Behind them, Perdition Flats slept under a blanket of stars, unaware that the next 24 hours would determine whether truth or corruption would prevail in this corner of the territory. Ahead lay 3 cache sites containing evidence that could topple a conspiracy reaching to the highest levels of government. And between the sleeping town and the hidden truth rode a broken man and a traumatized horse, bound together by shared purpose and the ghost of a good man who had died trying to do the right thing. The real test was just beginning. Dawn was breaking over the eastern peaks when Hellspike suddenly stopped, his ears pricked forward and his whole body alert to something Luke couldn't yet perceive. They had been riding for 6 hours through increasingly difficult terrain, climbing steadily toward Widow's Peak, and Luke had learned to trust the horse's instincts completely. "What is it, boy?" Luke whispered, dismounting to give his legs a rest and to study their surroundings. They stood on a narrow trail that wound between towering pines, with the peak visible above them through the trees. According to Whitmore's map, they were close, perhaps a mile from where the evidence was buried. But Hellspike's behavior suggested they weren't alone on the mountain. Luke pulled out his field glasses and scanned the trail ahead. There, a glint of metal among the rocks about 500 yards up the slope. Someone was waiting for them. Someone who had anticipated their route and positioned himself to control the high ground. "Looks like we've got company," Luke murmured to Hellspike. "Question is, are they friendly or hostile?" The horse answered by backing away from the trail and turning toward a game path that led through denser timber. Luke had learned to read Hellspike's signals, and this one was clear. Danger ahead, alternative route available. They spent the next hour picking their way through deadfall and undergrowth, following paths that seemed to exist only in Hellspike's memory. The horse moved with confidence, even when Luke could see no trail at all, navigating by landmarks and instincts developed during countless rides with his murdered master. When they finally emerged from the timber, Luke found himself looking at a sight that made his blood run cold. Spread out below them, in a small clearing, was a camp containing at least a dozen armed men, their horses picketed nearby and weapons stacked with military precision. Federal agents? Luke wondered aloud, but Hellspike's continued agitation suggested otherwise. Luke focused his field glasses on the camp and felt his heart sink. These weren't lawmen, they were the same kind of professional killers he'd encountered in Perdition Flats, led by a man he recognized as one of Carter's companions from the Territorial Land Office. They had been betrayed. Someone in the federal operation had leaked their plans, and now Blackwood's allies were positioned to intercept them at every cache site. Luke was considering their options when Hellspike suddenly wheeled and crashed back into the timber. A rifle shot cracked through the morning air, the bullet splintering bark inches from where Luke's head had been a moment before. "Go!" Luke shouted, vaulting into the saddle as more shots rang out behind them. Hellspike plunged down the mountainside through terrain that should have been impossible to navigate at speed. Branches whipped past Luke's face, and rocks scattered under the horse's hooves, but somehow they stayed upright and kept moving. The stallion's sure-footedness was supernatural, as if he could see safe paths where none seemed to exist. Behind them, Luke could hear shouting and the sound of horses crashing through the underbrush in pursuit. Their hunters were skilled, but they lacked Hellspike's intimate knowledge of this country. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, they broke out of the forest onto a ridge that overlooked a different valley entirely. Luke reined in Hellspike and listened carefully. The sounds of pursuit had faded, at least temporarily. "That was too close," Luke said, patting the horse's sweaty neck. "They knew we were coming. Someone told them." Hellspike snorted and pawed the ground, then turned to look back the way they had come. His message was clear. The enemy was still out there, still hunting them. Luke pulled out Whitmore's map and tried to determine their current position. The detour had taken them several miles off course, but it might have actually worked in their favor. They were now approaching the first cache site from an unexpected direction. "Can you find it from here?" Luke asked, showing the map to Hellspike. The horse studied the paper with obvious intelligence, then turned and began picking his way along the ridge toward a distinctive rock formation that matched one of Whitmore's landmarks. They found the cache site exactly where Whitmore's notes had indicated a lightning-struck oak tree standing alone on a small plateau. Its blackened trunk split, but still standing like a monument to nature's violence. As they approached, Luke felt Hellspike tense beneath him, and he understood why. This was where Thomas Whitmore had died. The horse approached the tree slowly, his steps careful and reverent. Luke dismounted and let Hellspike have a moment to grieve at the place where his master had made his final stand. The stallion nuzzled the scarred bark and whickered softly, a sound that spoke of loss and longing. "I know, boy, but we're going to make this right." Luke began searching for the buried evidence, using landmarks described in Whitmore's journal. 20 paces east of the tree, near a distinctive boulder shaped like a sleeping bear, Luke dug carefully with his hands, not wanting to damage whatever lay beneath. His fingers found metal, a lockbox wrapped in oilcloth, and buried just deep enough to protect it from weather and casual discovery. Inside were the documents Hayes had described, original territorial surveys showing valuable mineral deposits and water rights, plus correspondence proving that Federal Land Office officials had been filing false reports to keep land prices artificially low. But there was something else in the box, something that made Luke's blood freeze. A partial list of federal agents working the conspiracy case, with several names crossed out in red ink. Names of agents who were now dead, according to the dates written beside each crossed-out entry. At the bottom of the list, in different handwriting, was a notation that made everything clear. All field agents compromised. Washington operation blown. Execute termination protocol immediately. Luke understood now why their escape had been anticipated. The corruption went deeper than anyone had realized, deep enough to reach into the federal operation itself. Someone in Marshal Hayes's organization was feeding information to the conspirators. Hellspike's sudden alert posture made Luke look up from the documents. The horse was staring back toward the valley, his ears pricked forward and his nostrils flaring. Luke grabbed his field glasses and scanned their back trail. Their riders emerging from the timber they had escaped through earlier, at least 8 men, moving with the systematic precision of a military patrol. They had picked up Luke and Hellspike's trail and were closing in fast. Luke shoved the documents back into the lockbox and secured it in his saddlebags. "Time to go, partner. We've got what we came for, but it won't do any good if we don't live to deliver it." As he mounted, Luke made a decision that went against every tactical instinct he'd developed during the war. Instead of running, instead of trying to evade their pursuers, he was going to face them head-on. Because he'd finally understood what this was really about. The men hunting them weren't just trying to recover stolen evidence. They were trying to eliminate the last witnesses to a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of territorial and federal government. Thomas Whitmore had died at this tree, murdered by men who thought they could bury the truth along with his body. But they had made one crucial mistake. They had underestimated the intelligence and loyalty of his horse. Hellspike had brought Luke here not just to recover evidence, but to finish what his master had started. And Luke intended to do exactly that, no matter what it cost. Luke had barely finished securing the lockbox when he spotted something that made his heart race. A Winchester rifle, weathered but still functional, half hidden beneath a pile of stones near the lightning-struck oak. Thomas Whitmore's rifle, abandoned where he'd made his final stand against his killers. "He tried to fight them off from here," Luke murmured, lifting the weapon and checking its action. 3 cartridges remained in the magazine, not much, but better than facing 8 armed men with only his sidearm. Hellspike whickered urgently, and Luke looked up to see their pursuers had reached the base of the plateau. They were spreading out, trying to surround the position, moving with the confidence of men who believed they had their quarry trapped. Luke recognized their leader now, not one of Blackwood's local hired guns, but the supposed federal marshal who had tried to have Hellspike killed. A man with the authority to coordinate operations across territorial boundaries and the connections to know exactly where Luke would be heading. "You boys are making a mistake," Luke called out, his voice carrying clearly in the thin mountain air. "I'm working with federal authorities. Stand down and identify yourselves." The response was a rifle shot that kicked up dirt near Hellspike's hooves. The horse didn't flinch, if anything. He moved closer to Luke, as if offering his support for whatever was coming next. "Thomas Whitmore probably said something similar," the leader shouted back. "Didn't do him much good." "You killed him?" "I supervised, just like I'm going to supervise your death and your horses. Should have minded your own business, stranger." Luke felt anger building in his chest, not the hot, reckless fury that got men killed in battle, but the cold, focused rage that made them dangerous. These men had murdered a federal agent, tortured an innocent animal, and were now planning to eliminate the evidence of their crimes. "Come and get me," Luke called back, chambering a round in Whitmore's rifle. What followed was unlike any battle Luke had experienced during the war. His opponents were skilled and well-equipped, but they were also overconfident, expecting to face a lone horsebreaker rather than a veteran cavalry scout who had survived 4 years of the bloodiest conflict in American history. Luke used the terrain to his advantage, moving from position to position around the lightning-struck tree while Hellspike provided mobile cover. The horse seemed to understand exactly what was needed, positioning himself to block angles of attack and even using his hooves to kick rocks toward their enemies when they got too close. The Winchester spoke 3 times, and 3 men went down. Luke's remaining cartridges were in his saddlebags, but reaching them meant exposing himself to crossfire from multiple directions. That's when Hellspike did something that took Luke's breath away. The Stallion moved deliberately to where one of the fallen men lay, used his teeth to pick up the man's rifle, and carried it back to Luke with the careful precision of a trained retriever. "Jesus," Luke whispered, accepting the weapon. "You really are something special." The tide of battle shifted when Luke heard familiar voices among their attackers. Marshal Hayes and Snake Rawlings, the Texas Ranger, were working their way up the plateau from the eastern approach. "Luke," Hayes called out, "we tracked you from town. Are you all right?" "Stay back," Luke shouted in response. "These aren't all Blackwood's men. Some of them are federal." A moment of confusion rippled through the attacking force, and Luke used the distraction to put another shot into their leader's chest. The man dropped his rifle and staggered backward, clutching at the spreading red stain on his shirt. "How?" he gasped, looking at Luke with genuine surprise. "How did you know? Your mistake was trying to kill the horse instead of just recovering the evidence." Luke replied, keeping the rifle trained on the dying man. "Made it clear you knew he could lead people to the cache sites. Only way you could know that was if you'd read Whitmore's journal." "Which journal?" Hayes demanded, arriving at the tree line with Snake and 2 other men Luke didn't recognize. Luke studied the federal marshal's face carefully. The one Whitmore hid in Hellspike's feed box, the one that details how deep this conspiracy really goes. Hayes's expression didn't change, but Luke caught the slight tension around his eyes, the tell of a man who just realized his cover was blown. "I don't know what you're talking about," Hayes said evenly. "We need to get you and that evidence back to town before more of Blackwood's men show up." "The only problem with that," Luke replied, still holding the rifle ready, "is that Blackwood's men shouldn't have known where to find us unless someone in your organization told them." The confrontation that followed was brief but decisive. Hayes went for his gun, confident that his authority and backup would carry the day. But Snake, the real Texas Ranger, was faster, putting 2 bullets into the corrupt marshal before he could clear leather. "Damn," Snake said, holstering his weapon. "I was hoping we were wrong about him." "You suspected?" "For weeks. Too many operations were getting compromised. Too many agents were dying. Hayes was the only one with access to all the intelligence." Luke looked around at the aftermath of the battle. "How many others?" Hayes was the ringleader, at least on the federal side. The territorial officials are another matter entirely. Snake gestured toward the lockbox. "What did you find?" Luke opened the box and showed them the documents, the falsified surveys, the correspondence, and most damning of all, the list of murdered federal agents. "This is enough to bring down the entire network," one of Snake's companions observed. "Trials, congressional investigations, maybe even criminal charges against sitting territorial officials. If we can get it to the right people," Luke said, "how do we know who else might be compromised?" Snake smiled grimly. "That's why we're taking it directly to Washington. No territorial authorities, no local federal offices. Straight to the Attorney General." As they prepared to leave the plateau, Luke took one last look at the lightning-struck oak where Thomas Whitmore had died. The tree stood blackened but unbowed, a testament to survival in the face of overwhelming force. Hellspike approached the tree once more, touching his muzzle gently to the scarred bark. Then he turned away, ready to carry his master's legacy toward justice. "Come on, partner," Luke said, mounting the stallion. "Let's go finish what Tom started." The ride down from Widow's Peak was somber but hopeful. They had the evidence, they had trustworthy federal agents to deliver it, and they had eliminated the immediate threat to their mission. But Luke knew the real work was just beginning. Bringing down a conspiracy this large and well-connected would take time, patience, and the kind of courage that Thomas Whitmore had shown when he chose to fight rather than look the other way. At least now, thanks to a traumatized horse and a broken-down cavalry scout, the truth would finally have its day in court. 6 months later, Luke stood in the same spot where he'd first encountered Hellspike, but everything had changed. The breaking pen was gone, replaced by a proper pasture where the black stallion grazed peacefully in the morning sun. The rope burns and scars had healed, leaving only faint traces of the abuse he'd endured. More importantly, the fear was gone from Hellspike's eyes, replaced by the calm confidence of a horse who knew he was valued and protected. "Hard to believe it's the same animal," Doc Henley observed, joining Luke at the fence rail. 6 months ago, he was trying to kill anyone who came near him. Now look at him. Luke smiled, watching as Hellspike approached the fence to investigate their conversation. The horse had grown sleek and healthy, his coat gleaming with the care of someone who understood that healing took time and patience. "He was never really dangerous," Luke replied. "Just scared and angry. Can't blame him for that." The trials in Washington had exceeded everyone's expectations. Thomas Whitmore's evidence had brought down not just the territorial conspiracy, but a network of corruption that reached into Congress itself. 14 federal officials had been arrested, including 3 sitting territorial judges and a deputy attorney general who had been coordinating the land fraud from Washington. Ezra Blackwood was serving 20 years in federal prison. The men who had actually murdered Whitmore, including the corrupt Marshal Hayes, were dead, killed either in the gun battle at Widow's Peak or during subsequent arrests. More importantly, the stolen lands had been returned to their rightful owners or sold at fair prices to families who actually intended to work them. The water rights that had been illegally transferred were restored, and new territorial surveys were conducted by federal inspectors who had been thoroughly vetted for honesty. "Got a letter from Snake yesterday," Luke mentioned, pulling the folded paper from his vest pocket. "Says the last of the appeals were rejected. The convictions are final. Justice served then, as much as it ever is." Doc Henley nodded thoughtfully. "And what about you? Any regrets about staying on as sheriff?" Luke considered the question, watching Hellspike move with the fluid grace that had made him such a valuable partner during those dangerous months of investigation. After the trials, the people of Perdition Flats had asked Luke to take over as permanent sheriff, and he'd accepted, partly because someone needed to ensure that corruption didn't take root again, but mostly he'd stayed because of the horse. "No regrets," Luke said finally. "This is good work. Important work. And Hellspike? He's my deputy," Luke replied with a slight smile. "Best partner I've ever had." It was true, in ways that went beyond humor. Luke had discovered that Hellspike's intelligence and training made him invaluable for law enforcement work. The horse could track suspects across difficult terrain, find hidden evidence, and even identify people who were carrying weapons or contraband. More than once, Hellspike's alert posture had warned Luke about potential danger before he could perceive it himself. But their partnership went deeper than professional necessity. Both had been broken by violence and betrayal, and both had found healing in their shared commitment to justice. Luke had learned to trust completely, and Hellspike had learned to love again. "Speaking of which," Doc Henley said, glancing toward the main street, "looks like you've got visitors." Luke turned to see a familiar figure approaching Martha from the Silver Dollar, but she wasn't alone. A woman Luke didn't recognize walked beside her, tall and elegant with graying auburn hair and intelligent eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. "Luke," Martha called out, "I'd like you to meet someone. This is Elizabeth Morrison, the real Elizabeth Morrison." Luke felt his eyebrows raise. During the investigation, they'd learned that the federal agents had assumed the identities of real people, including Sheriff Morrison. Luke had wondered what had happened to the actual residents whose names had been borrowed. "Miss Morrison," Luke said, touching the brim of his hat, "I hope you'll forgive the confusion about your identity." Elizabeth smiled, and Luke noticed that it transformed her entire face. "No confusion to forgive. I was working in Denver during all the excitement. Martha's been filling me in on what I missed." Elizabeth was Tom Whitmore's special friend, Martha explained, with the careful delicacy of someone navigating emotional territory. "She's come back to settle his affairs and decide what to do about his ranch." Luke felt something shift in his understanding. He looked at Hellspike, who had moved closer to the fence and was watching the conversation with obvious interest. "The horse knows you," Luke observed. "We spent a lot of time together before Tom died," Elizabeth replied, approaching the fence slowly. Hellspike extended his muzzle, and she stroked it gently. "Tom used to say that Hellspike was the best judge of character he'd ever met. If the horse liked you, you were all right. If he didn't, you probably deserved whatever happened next," Luke finished. "Exactly." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching as Hellspike continued to nuzzle Elizabeth's hand. The horse's obvious affection for her was unmistakable, and Luke found himself curious about this woman who had clearly meant something significant to Thomas Whitmore. "I've been thinking about Tom's ranch," Elizabeth said eventually. "It's too much for one person to manage, and I'm not really a rancher anyway. But I hate the idea of selling it to strangers who might not understand what Tom was trying to build there." Luke sensed where the conversation was heading. "What kind of understanding are you looking for? Someone who knew Tom, who appreciated what he stood for. Someone who understands that the land isn't just about cattle and profits, but about building something decent and honest." She paused, studying Luke's face. "Martha tells me you might be that someone." Luke looked out at the mountains, where he and Hellspike had risked their lives to recover evidence of a murdered man's courage, where they had fought together and learned to trust each other completely. "I've got responsibilities here in town," he said slowly. "Sheriff's job is part-time. Mostly," Martha interjected. "Town's quiet these days, with all the troublemakers either dead or in prison. You could probably run a small ranch and still handle the law enforcement duties." Luke felt Hellspike's attention focused on him, as if the horse understood exactly what was being discussed and had opinions about the outcome. "What do you think, partner?" Luke asked quietly. "Ready to go home?" Hellspike whickered softly and bobbed his head, a gesture so clearly affirmative that all three women laughed. "I think that's your answer," Elizabeth said. "When would you like to see the property?" "How about now?" Luke replied. "Hellspike knows the way." An hour later, they rode together toward Thomas Whitmore's ranch, Luke on Hellspike, Elizabeth on a gentle mare from the livery stable, and Martha driving a small wagon with supplies for what might be an extended visit. The day was perfect, with clear skies and a warm breeze that carried the scent of wildflowers from the meadows. As they crested the ridge that overlooked Whitmore's spread, Luke felt his breath catch. The ranch was beautiful, a log house nestled against a grove of aspens, good grazing land stretching toward the mountains, and a creek that ran clear and strong through the heart of the property. "Tom loved this place," Elizabeth said quietly. "Used to say it was what the whole territory could become if people had the courage to do things right, instead of just doing things easy." Luke dismounted and walked to the edge of the overlook, taking in the view. Hellspike followed, standing beside him as they surveyed the land that could be their new home. "What do you think?" Luke asked the horse. "Is this where we belong?" Hellspike's answer was to trot down the slope toward the ranch house, looking back as if to say, "What are you waiting for?" Luke laughed, the first completely carefree sound he'd made in months. "Guess that settles it." As they rode toward their new future, Luke reflected on the strange journey that had brought him to this moment. He'd come to Perdition Flats as a broken man looking for work, and he'd found purpose, partnership, and now the possibility of something that felt remarkably like home. Behind him, the town that had been saved from corruption dozed peacefully in the afternoon sun. Ahead lay Thomas Whitmore's dream of what honest people could build when they had the courage to stand up for what was right. And beside him rode Hellspike, no longer the traumatized, violent animal that had been shaped by fear and pain, but a confident partner ready for whatever challenges lay ahead. Luke reached over and patted the stallion's neck, feeling the powerful muscles beneath the smooth coat, remembering the trust that had been built one careful moment at a time. "Come on, partner," he said, touching his heels gently to Hellspike's sides. "Let's go home." The black stallion responded with the smooth, ground-covering gait that had carried them through danger and brought them safely to justice. But now, instead of fleeing from enemies or searching for hidden evidence, they were simply riding toward a future that held the promise of peace. Sometimes, Luke thought, the best endings were also the simplest beginnings.